Hopefully this screencast will help you with your writing assignment that you have coming up, because many of you completing that first written response definitely missed the items with the Federalist debate. So let's look at this. I've asked you to look at this sheet and define these terms, which is pretty much what we've been doing for the last couple of classes. In this screencast, we're going to be looking at the Federalist anti-federalist debate. Many students are struggling with this. The federal government never resolves the issue of slavery or race. And pretty much this is what we've been doing the last couple of classes, and this is what we're going to be doing in the future, kind of looking at connecting these items here to the civil rights movement. We're going to start off with the American Revolution. As you know, that the American Revolution was fought because we wanted to break away from the British Empire. And this belief system here that I've put in bold, men are created equal, it initially starts out with this contradiction. How can you fight a war over equality yet deny a significant amount of your population equality and freedom? So just from the start, there seems to be a contradiction with regard to the ideas this country was founded on in comparison to the history of the day, primarily talking about slavery. So the leaders get together, they create their country, and they come up with their constitution, but they make sure that they put language in the constitution to address slavery. And I find it interesting. Because remember, they're fighting for equality, yet they made it a point in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution to say that they're going to have a reference to slavery, and that Congress, the organization that is responsible for passing laws, cannot pass any legislation dealing with regard to the migration and importation of such persons. So from the start, they've created this document, and they are just addressing slavery, which goes back to the point I've been trying to make, that are never really resolving the issue of slavery or race. It just kind of is delayed all the way up to the Civil War, and then that kind of plays out in some way during up to the Civil Rights Movement. The question here is, should the legislature end or keep slavery? As you know, you have a legislative and executive branch of government. So the question here is, should anybody kind of go out on a limb in any of these organizations and try to change the Constitution or come up with legislation that is going to end slavery? Can you imagine any president coming out either strongly for or strongly against slavery? You could look at any issue, and there are definitely going to be people on both sides. But the point here is that slavery is such a big force in the United States at this point with regard to the economics, that there's probably going to be no politician that really wants to go out and say, yes, we are going to end the institution of slavery, which creates this particular problem. Should slaveholding states be allowed to count slaves for votes in Congress? So this is leading us up to the 3/5 compromise, which is the first compromise or selling out or half-assed solution to this issue of slavery and race in America. As you know, within the legislative branch of government, you have a House and a Senate. This one right here is based off of population. So the question you want to ask here is whether or not states that have a significant amount of slaves should count those slaves as actual people. Because if this is going to give you representation in a vote in the federal government, that means that you are counting slaves, yet you don't technically consider slaves to be people. I don't necessarily know how that works. So eventually they come up with the 3/5 compromise that for every 5 slaves that a state has, they will count 3, which is how they're going to come up with their number for representation in the House. However, on the issue of taxes, so those same states in this area here that have the majority of the slaves, they do not want to count their slave population. So there seems to be some hypocrisy. On the issue of paying taxes for your people to the federal government, we don't want to pay. But on the issue of counting those same people that we don't want to pay taxes on for representation in Congress, we want to be able to count those people. And again, they don't resolve the issue with regard to the Constitution. They don't resolve it here. They just come up with this half solution, this three-fifths compromise, and that just kind of continues to play out. They could have ended it after the American Revolution. They could have ended it, and they came up with the legislative branch, yet they made a choice not to. So then the question now that emerges eventually is, well, what do you do with new states? Should slavery exist in some of those new states? So here we're looking at the Northwest Ordinance here, and this creates a problem. If you think about the country being split here, half the states are for ending slavery and the other half are for keeping it. These new states, if they come in either for or against slavery, that right there is going to sway the balance in Congress. And that's the issue here, that the Northwest Territory, creates this debate. What are we going to do with regard to slaves in this particular area? Keep in mind that is also the point where Susan B. Anthony and Katie Stanton are trying to start the women's rights movement at Seneca Falls, just throwing that in there. By the time we get to the 1820s, we have a Missouri Compromise line, which pretty much says that those new states that are coming in, notice here, unorganized territory, they're about to admit more states into the Union. And again, it's going to throw off the balance. So the decision here is, we're going to create this border, and states north of the border and south of the border will depend on looking at the key here. The slave states, if you are below the line, that's what you come in as. And if you're above the line, that's what you come in as, free. So again, they don't deal with the issue. You have these new territories that are coming into existence or, applying for statehood, and you don't really want to come out for slavery, against slavery. Just seems to be deadlocked. Then we get to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and once again, you have more territory. So the debate is going to come up once again. Notice here how the year is now 1854. So they haven't resolved this issue. They didn't resolve it with the Constitution. They didn't resolve it at the American Revolution. They just keep putting this thing off here. And this is eventually going to lead to the Bleeding Kansas. Keep in mind that when we talk about the Federalist debate, we're talking about the federal government and whether or not we should have a strong or a weak federal government that I'll get into in a minute. Bleeding Kansas, pretty much what the solution is here is, well, whoever gets there can determine what happens. So let's just say 80% of the people get to this new territory in Kansas, and they decide they want to keep slavery, then that's where slavery is going to go, in that direction. It's a reversal of the line. Now the line really doesn't matter. What matters is how many people in your new state want to have slaves in comparison to those that do not. So again, the federal government puts this off and doesn't really address the issue, which creates the Bleeding Kansas incident, which may or may not be considered the first shot in the Civil War. You have enough people that are for slavery and enough people against slavery, and what's up for grabs is the outcome of the new state, and they pretty much fight over this particular issue, and the federal government doesn't really get involved with really resolving this issue once again. So these states right here seem to have a history of challenging some of that federal legislation. They seem to be resistant, which is why the term states' rights does mean something. As you can look at this particular image here in 2011, where this girl had worn this shirt here, and people took offense to this, and this was in East Windsor. And her mother's argument was, we're from the South, and the South has a history of fighting against the federal government for states' rights, and that's what that flag represents. Of course, the issue that history really is about is whether or not the state should have the right to own slaves. So you figure out what you think about that issue. Anyway, Fugitive Slave Law. Now we have an issue where slaves from the South are trying to escape to the North. And this one I always find interesting because the federal government gets involved. Now the federal government is going to say, well, if your slave escapes from Tennessee and winds up, let's say, in New York, the New Yorkers have to send this individual back. So it's interesting that the federal government is taking a stance with regard to slaves that have escaped, but they don't want to take a stand on any of these other issues. They just really seem to be concerned about, certain issues. And again, a lot of this is politics. You own 100 slaves and 90 escape to a free state, claiming they're free. You have in your possession paperwork that claims your slave is your property. What should happen? Just a debate question there. The Fugitive Slave Law, you do have property. That human being is property. And think about like your vehicle. I know this might, seem upsetting, but if you owned a car and that car wound up in another state, the fact that it's in another state, does it have, do you lose possession of it? And that is a similar argument, because remember, these individuals are people. They're people, but they are considered property. So the Federalist, anti-federalist debate, and we've been talking a lot about this, and really this is something that goes back to the American Revolution. The Federalists is the federal government, and these are the first two political parties. And the question here is whether or not we're going to have a strong or weak federal government. So looking at your list here, that's kind of where we're at up until this point right here. I've addressed, for the most part, all of these items, and now I'm going to be getting into the political parties. So the first political parties are about this debate: the Federalists or the anti-federalists. Do we want to have a strong federal government or a weak federal government? And it's interesting to note that the anti-federalists are the individuals that are for states' rights. These are the individuals that are on the Democratic side, the Democratic Party. If you looked at the evolution of political parties, that's what you would come to find out, that the Party of Dixie in the 1800s, these were the individuals that wanted to have a weak federal government. They did not want a big federal government to come in and say, we are going to end slavery. And that really seems to be the main issue in the late 1700s going into the mid 1800s with the Civil War. So the Democratic Republican Party split in 1812, and it's splitting over this particular issue. I mean, you start to see new political parties come into existence, and one of the issues that they're definitely debating over is this issue of slavery. So here, states' rights matter more. Kind of just put that there. And they're trying to challenge, once again, the federal government. What matters more, the federal or the states' rights? If you look at what's going on with the COVID crisis, you could see some connections where, the federal government has said we are going to play, a backup. We are not going to get involved. I guess that's a weak federal response. However, then, there have been other issues where the president has said things like, I'm the one in charge here, and what I say goes. So it kind of seems to be a weird meshing of both state and federal government. I guess depending on what helps you in that particular situation. I don't really know how to address it because it seems to be a combination of both. If it helps me that I'm a strong federalist, then fine. But then another comment might be a strong anti-federalist. Anyway, that's looking too much at the COVID crisis. I was just trying to make a connection because that seems to be something that is being talked about once again. Lincoln-Douglas debate. This is actually a Senate seat before Lincoln is going to run for the presidency. And the Lincoln-Douglas debates are interesting because as he is running, the issue of slavery comes up numerous times. And if you want, you can pause this and read. Here's Lincoln saying that he is not nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of the Negro, nor of qualifying them to hold office. He doesn't want to intermarry. He's saying a lot of things here. And Douglas on this side is not any nicer. He's actually a little more severe with his particular views. And the Lincoln-Douglas debates has its place in American history. Take a look at this section. That all men are equal upon principle, make exceptions to it. Where will it stop if one man says it does not mean a Negro? Why may not another man say it does not mean another man? If that declaration not the truth, let us get the statute book in which we find it and tear it out. So Lincoln in this particular debate series seems to be coming out as somebody that is not somebody that wants to clearly end slavery. doesn't seem to be somebody for it or against it. He seems to be taking a middle approach, and some would argue that's the reason why this individual was selected to, be the president. He really wasn't going to come out hard for ending slavery or keeping slavery. He was just going to maintain the status quo, which results in yet another half-ass solution. Goes a little bit more with regard to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Jackson, here you have yet another president. And Jackson, the big question here is, as the president, what can you do to end slavery? Can you come out hard for it? Or can you come out hard against it? And let's just say you come out hard against slavery and you end it. What could that actually mean for your political career? So these presidents have to walk a pretty fine line, and they have to worry about elections as opposed to taking a hard stance on the issue. Yet some people might look back and say that these individuals were definitely for slavery or against slavery. But when you look at collectively these leaders, they seem to be individuals in the as we get closer to the Civil War, really understanding that if they come out hard for or against, that could definitely mean their political career, which is why Lincoln, as I said before, was selected. At this point, we are in the Civil War. And the Emancipation Proclamation is interesting because the question here is whether or not Lincoln frees the slaves. So if we look at this particular map here, these states consider themselves a completely separate country. And these border states are ones that are, on the fence, undecided, these border states here. And so Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation frees the slaves here. And that could be problematic because it doesn't really free them here. And Lincoln does get some criticism. There's a big debate. Does Lincoln free the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation? Well, I guess he kind of does. And I guess he kind of doesn't, because these states do not consider themselves part of the United States. So technically, he's the president of this part. How can he pass any sort of legislation that is going to determine what happens here? So again, Lincoln's taking a middle approach. And in 1860, you see, another map here that's looking at the states that have decided to leave the Union, which is going to lead to the Civil War. And I know I have addressed the end of the Civil War with regard to these military districts here, which is something that I'll address next class. As well as these Reconstruction Amendments with the Klan. I mean, if we look at this one right here, the North wins the Civil War. The 13th Amendment is passed, which is going to free the slaves. This one is going to be about privileges and equality. You can't deny persons life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And now you have the right to vote. And these three amendments are going to be viewed as the federal government overstepping, going back to that federalist, anti-federalist debate, which is why groups like the Klan emerge. Next class, we might look at some of the KKK, if I can find a documentary on them. But, the Klan, the 15th Amendment is saying states have to allow votes. Well, if we could create a state law that prohibits this individual from voting, or maybe we just beat these individuals up, instill fear, that will keep us in line with the 15th Amendment, but it will also make sure that those individuals do not get the 15th Amendment, which is the whole point that I've been trying to make with the last few classes. Dred Scott, notice the years. I am kind of going back and forth here, trying to make a couple of points. Dred Scott is interesting because Dred Scott finds himself in a situation where his master dies, and this guy's questioning whether or not he's free. And he tries to take his case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court looks at his case and decides, we don't even consider you a citizen. Therefore, you are not entitled to any sort of privilege of a Supreme Court, which pretty much says a lot for the way the slaves were viewed. You are not citizens of this country. And Plessy Ferguson, which is eventually going to get us into segregation, And again, Plessy Ferguson is going to be about establishing federal support for state laws, which is something we're going to be looking at next couple of classes. We start looking at segregation laws and some of the individuals that fight for African American rights in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So here are your answers for the form, or for this study guide here. Notice how we have Jefferson and Jackson. I didn't really say much about the presidents in their stance, but if we look here at Jackson, his view was, well, let the people decide on slavery. Nice. You're the president, yet your approach is to let the people decide on slavery. Well, half the people are going to want it, half the people don't want it. So what does that say about you as a leader? I don't know. Jefferson owned slaves as well, disagrees morally. Again, somebody just can't come out. Here we have Buchanan and Lincoln. Again, I said Lincoln was more of a moderate on slavery, and Buchanan's argument was, well, it's a constitutional issue. I'm pointing these out because it seems like before the Civil War, each president, when confronted with the issue of slavery, seems to have their own opinion as far as what should happen. But the one thing that stays constant is that nobody's coming out hard for ending slavery, which allows this institution of slavery to continue without any changes, without any attempt to end it. So from this point, you have your answers. Review your notes, and we'll see how I connect this next class.